Imagine standing on a frozen shoreline, the wind howling like a pack of wolves, waves taller than buildings crashing and shattering against the docks. It's November 7th, 1913, and the Great Lakes are about to unleash a fury unlike anything this region has ever seen. They call it the White Hurricane, a storm so ferocious it swallowed entire ships, froze waters solid, and left hundreds fighting for their lives. You've heard of winter storms before, but nothing could prepare sailors, dock workers, or families for what's coming. The clouds gather black as soot, snow whipping sideways, temperatures plummeting with every gust. It starts quietly, deceptively, like a whisper before a scream. By nightfall, the lakes are a roaring monster, waves smashing, winds bending steel, ice forming faster than anyone can imagine. Boats are tossed like toys. Ships vanish. Families cling to each other, eyes wide, listening to the world breaking around them. Dozens will never make it home. Imagine seeing a vessel swallowed whole by the storm, its crew's screams lost to the wind. Imagine the deafening silence that follows, broken only by the crack of ice or the roar of breaking timbers. The White Hurricane didn't just hit the lakes, it struck into the very hearts of the people who lived beside them. And yet, this is only the beginning. What really happened on those frozen waves? Who survived, who was lost, and what horrors unfolded in the dark of that night? Stay with me, because the story of the White Hurricane is more than a storm. It's a tale of terror, courage, and unimaginable loss that will grip you from the first gust to the final wave. The first hints of trouble came earlier that week, almost innocuous if you didn't know what to look for. Sailors noticed the sudden drop in temperature, the wind sharpening like a blade, cutting through coats and gloves. On Lake Huron, John O'Malley, a seasoned freighter captain, was already uneasy. "The sky's wrong," he muttered to his first mate, squinting at clouds rolling in from the northwest, dark as coal, edges jagged like torn paper. "It feels like it's breathing." Most dismissed it. A cold snap in November wasn't unusual. But this was different. Ice began forming along the shorelines, thin at first, glittering under the weak November sun, but stubbornly spreading. By the evening, snowflakes weren't just falling, they were stabbing, whipped sideways by gusts that grew in intensity with every hour. Meanwhile, families in coastal towns sensed something in the air. Sarah Whitman, mother of 3 in Port Huron, noticed the children shivering, their breath fogging in the kitchen. "It's colder than it ought to be," she said, pulling blankets tighter around their shoulders. Outside, the docks groaned under the early frost, and fishermen hurried to secure boats that already rocked against icy chains. Across the lakes, radio warnings flickered in and out, often delayed, often ignored. The technology was limited, the understanding of storms insufficient. Could anyone have truly known the magnitude of what was coming? By November 8th, the storm's appetite became clear. Winds from the northwest screamed at 70, 80 miles per hour, biting through layers of wool and leather. Waves began to climb unnaturally high, throwing spray that froze mid-air, coating decks in ice thick enough to make men slip and fall. Dave Matthews, a deckhand on the SS James Carruthers, described the terror vividly. It was like the lake itself had grown teeth. "I could hear her creaking, feel her shiver with every wave, and I knew she might not last the night. Crews tied themselves to railings, gloves frozen stiff, eyes stinging from snow and salt. But nothing could hold back what was coming." By late evening, the storm was unrecognizable. On Lake Erie, the schooner Regina found herself trapped in a wall of snow and wind. Mike Gallagher, one of the crew, shouted over the roar, "We're not going to make it! The waves are higher than the mast!" Below deck, men huddled, praying, whispering farewells to loved ones they'd never see again. On shore, families listened helplessly as radio crackled reports of missing vessels, bodies washing ashore, Entire ships believed lost. Imagine standing there, listening to that static, hearing names you know, neighbors, friends, family. What would you do if that was your brother or your father out there? Across the lakes, the storm's fury was relentless. On Lake Superior, the freighter Charles S. Price struggled against 35-foot waves that seemed to surge in synchronized rhythm, crushing anything in their path. Crewman Harry Benson described it. Every wave was like a hammer. Every gust felt like it could snap the ship in two. I held on to the railing with all my strength, praying we wouldn't roll. He wasn't alone. Hundreds of men faced the same nightmare, caught between metal and ice, wind and water, and the storm hadn't even reached its peak yet. At night, the chaos intensified. Snow blinded the world. Ice coated everything in a deadly glaze. On shore, people like Sarah Whitman could only huddle by stoves, staring out at the dark, listening to the wind scream across frozen waters, wondering if their husbands, sons, or brothers were alive. I just kept whispering their names, Sarah said, over and over, hoping it would reach them somehow. Could you imagine the anxiety, the helplessness? What would you do if you were waiting, praying, not knowing if your loved one had survived the waves? And then, when it seemed the storm might relent, it shifted. Winds twisted, temperatures dropped further, ice sheets grinding and colliding like titanic gears. The first ships began to founder. The ice claimed their decks. The waves claimed their hulls. The lakes had become a cage of frozen chaos. Survivors clung to splintered wood or tossed lifeboats, their teeth chattering, faces numb, hands raw. Every scream echoed over the snow, lost in the storm. Who would survive? Who would be next? The white hurricane was only beginning to show its teeth, and the real terror, the full, unimaginable horror, was still to come. By the morning of November 9th, the white hurricane had fully awakened, and the Great Lakes were no longer just bodies of water. They were monstrous, living predators. The winds had reached a sustained 80 miles per hour, waves towering like buildings, ice sheets colliding with thunderous crashes. Visibility was near zero. Sailors could see only the wall of snow and water ahead. On Lake Huron, John O'Malley's freighter, already battered by the previous night, struggled to stay upright. "We're barely cutting through it," he shouted, voice raw from the wind. "The lake's swallowing us." Below deck, crewmen clung to rails, their knuckles white, hearts hammering. Every crash against the hull felt like the ship itself might split apart. Meanwhile, on shore, towns like Port Huron and Duluth were becoming islands of despair. Streets vanished under snowdrifts and ice. Roofs groaned under weight, and chimneys spewed smoke that whipped sideways. Families huddled in kitchens, clinging to one another, eyes wide with terror as every gust sounded like a battering ram. Sarah Whitman, still praying for her husband and sons, described the nightmarish scene. "The wind was screaming so loud I thought it would rip the house apart. The snow hit the windows like stones, and I kept thin. King, are they alive? Are they out there in that hell?" Could you imagine the helplessness, knowing your loved ones were fighting for life on waves taller than anything you'd ever seen? On Lake Michigan, the schooner Regina was being pounded beyond recognition. Crewman Mike Gallagher recalled, "The mast snapped like a twig. I grabbed onto the rigging, and the next wave hit us broadside. I thought we were done. Boats weren't just rocking, they were being flung sideways, decks cracking under frozen weight." On board the SS Charles S. Price, Harry Benson and his crew were facing ice that coated every surface. "Every step could kill you," Benson said. "I slipped, smashed my shoulder, but I had to keep going. We couldn't stop." Waves slammed into the hull with a deafening roar, tossing men like dolls, ripping lifeboats from fastenings. Imagine holding onto wood, drifting in icy water, knowing hypothermia could claim you in minutes. How would you have stayed alive? Rescue efforts were chaotic, almost heroic in their desperation. On shore, Dave Matthews from the James Carruthers spotted men clinging to wreckage and ran into blizzard conditions to help. I couldn't leave them, he said. I just kept dragging one after another to shore. Some were frozen stiff, others screaming for help I couldn't give fast enough. The Red Cross and local volunteers mobilized, braving nearly impossible conditions, but the storm wasn't done. Snow and ice blocked roads, trains were stalled, and telegraph lines were down. Messages were delayed by hours. Every minute mattered, but there was almost nothing anyone could do to stop nature's wrath. The storm reached its peak that afternoon. Lake Superior became a cauldron of white water, ice, and wind. Captain John O'Malley watched helplessly as a freighter was ripped apart yards from his own vessel. I could see men thrown into the waves, he said, voice trembling. Some disappeared instantly, some clinging, gasping for air. I had to keep going, couldn't stop to help. On smaller vessels, men tried to navigate blindly, yelling directions over the roar, but waves toppled masts, tore sails, crushed hulls. The lake was a frozen, boiling nightmare, indifferent to life or effort. Onshore, families faced different horrors. Fires broke out from chimneys collapsing, windows shattering from wind pressure. People huddled, covering mouths from snow and smoke, terrified that the next gust would blow away their entire house. Sarah Whitman described hearing the distant roar of waves hitting the docks. It was like a freight train, over and over. I couldn't stop thinking, is he alive? Is my husband alive? And then the dreaded knock on the door, the news that someone didn't make it, hearts breaking across towns. Could you bear that? How would you have held it together? By nightfall, dozens of ships had been lost, hundreds stranded or clinging to debris, and the storm still raged. Waves continued to smash against ice-laden shores, winds shrieking, snow cutting like knives. Men and women alike were tested to their limits. Praying, screaming, surviving, watching. The white hurricane wasn't just a storm. It was a living, breathing force, claiming every moment, every breath, every hope. And as night drew on, those who survived faced the impossible. What came next in the endless frozen chaos? By November 10th, the storm had entered a second, even deadlier phase. The lakes were unrecognizable, frozen sheets of water grinding against jagged ice, waves taller than houses crashing over struggling ships. On Lake Erie, the freighter James Carruthers was being battered like a toy in a child's hands. Dave Matthews, barely holding on to a splintered railing, shouted over the roar. "I don't know how much longer we can last." Snow whipped Cy. D-ways, stinging exposed skin, freezing hair to ice. The storm wasn't just hitting the lakes, it was invading everything near them. Docks, towns, rail lines, homes. Every sound was amplified, the crack of timber, the roar of waves, the screams of men swept into the frigid water. Could you imagine hearing that and knowing the next wave might be the one that ends everything? On Lake Superior, Captain John O'Malley faced a nightmare beyond comprehension. The Charles S. Price was clinging to survival, its deck buried in ice. Crewman Harry Benson struggled to keep the engines running. "I could barely move," he said. "My hands were frozen solid, but if we stopped, we were done." They worked through exhaustion, desperation, fear, knowing that one misstep meant death. Across the lakes, men and women faced the same brutal calculus. Every choice was life or death. Could you have made the right call if you were there? Meanwhile, on shore, families continued to endure the storm's relentless assault. Sarah Whitman and her children sat by a barely functioning stove, staring through snow-streaked windows at a world gone white. "We didn't know what to hope for," she whispered. "Every knock at the door could be news we weren't ready for." Fires from collapsed chimneys flickered across towns, competing with the blizzard's glare. Roads vanished beneath drifts, communication lines down, leaving people isolated, terrified, and desperate for word of loved ones. Imagine hearing that distant, muffled cry of someone in trouble and knowing you might not be able to reach them. What would you do in that moment? Amid the chaos, acts of courage emerged. Dock workers waded into freezing waters to pull men from icy waves. Fishermen navigated wreckage to rescue stranded sailors. Mike Gallagher, once aboard the Regina, recalled dragging a nearly frozen crewmate onto a lifeboat. I thou. 80 was gone. His lips were blue, and he wasn't moving. I kept shaking him, yelling, "Come on, don't give up." And somehow, he did. Stories like these multiplied across the lakes. Every survivor carried a tale of terror and bravery intertwined. If you were there, what would you have done? Could you have rescued a stranger while fighting for your own life? The storm's reach seemed endless. Ice floes collided with docks, crushing boats, tossing them like toys. On Lake Michigan, the schooner Drake faced waves that washed over the entire deck repeatedly. Crewman Thomas Reed described the chaos. "I thought we were dead for sure." The deck disappeared underwater. I grabbed onto the mast with everything I had. I didn't care if I broke my arms. I just didn't want to let go. Hours stretched like days, snow and wind blurring all sense of time. Ships were gone before anyone could react. People were pulled into icy depths, some clinging to wreckage for hours, others vanishing entirely. The sheer scale of destruction was almost incomprehensible. How would you have survived in freezing water, alone, surrounded by chaos? By late afternoon, some ships had managed to limp toward shore, battered but intact. Others were crushed, sinking under the relentless assault. On Lake Huron, John O'Malley finally saw a glimmer of hope, a lifeboat with men clinging desperately, their faces blue, eyes wide with terror. He maneuvered closer, pulling them aboard one by one. "We saved a few," he said later, "but for every one we got, 3 were gone." It was the same grim reality across the region, heroism overshadowed by staggering loss. The lakes had claimed their toll, but the storm was far from finished. Snow continued to fall, winds continued to scream, and the night promised more terror. And now, I want to hear from you. Did your grandparents or family ever survive a storm like this? Maybe. A hurricane, blizzard, or shipwreck story passed down through generations. Share those stories in the comments. Your words keep history alive and remind us just how fragile life can be when nature strikes without mercy. The White Hurricane wasn't just a battle with wind and ice. It was a test of endurance, courage, and the human will to survive. And as night fell again, those who had made it this far could only wait, shivering, praying, wondering if the lakes would ever let them live to see dawn. By November 11th, the White Hurricane had begun its slow, grudging retreat, but the lakes were far from tamed. Ice still stretched across the surface like jagged glass. Waves remained ferocious, and the air was a freezing whip. On Lake Superior, John O'Malley and his remaining crew surveyed the wreckage around them, shattered freighters, splintered lifeboats, bodies frozen mid-struggle, the smell of salt and ice hanging heavy. "It looked like the world had ended," he said, voice low. Every surviving ship carried its own tale of terror, every hand on deck a story of near death and perseverance. Could you imagine staring at that and knowing you were among the lucky few? On Lake Michigan, Thomas Reed clutched a lifeboat with Mike Gallagher and 3 others, water seeping through their frozen clothes. "We thought we were done," Reed said. "Every second felt like an hour, every wave like it could flip us over. But somehow we made it. The cold was relentless, seeping into bones, numbing faces, stealing strength. Men and women who had survived the worst now had to survive the aftershock, exhaustion, hypothermia, and despair. Fires on shore provided warmth, but only to those lucky enough to reach them. Many towns had lost bridges, rail lines, and power, leaving people trapped and isolated, staring at ruined landscapes. Could you have found your way home in that white nightmare? Wow. You have recognized anything? Meanwhile, rescue efforts reached a desperate crescendo. Volunteers waded into icy waters, ladders and ropes tossed towards stranded crews. Dave Matthews, once clinging to wreckage, helped others from the James Carruthers to safety. "I never thought I'd see the shore alive," he said. "We pulled men out, wrapped them in blankets, gave them what little warmth we had. Some thanked us, some we couldn't save. You can't imagine how many we left behind. Across the lakes, similar scenes played out again and again. Families who had feared the worst found loved ones alive or heartbreakingly gone. The human cost was staggering, yet courage persisted in frozen waves and battered docks. How would you have reacted, knowing so many lives depended on a few brave souls? Onshore, towns began the grim task of tallying losses. The storm had claimed at least 250 lives, destroyed over a dozen ships, and left hundreds more missing or injured. Houses were flattened, docks obliterated, rail lines twisted like wire. Sarah Whitman finally embraced her husband and sons, tears freezing on their cheeks. "We made it," she whispered. "We actually made it." But not everyone was so fortunate. Across the lakes, mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters grieved over bodies pulled from icy waters or feared lost forever. Could you have borne that grief while knowing your neighbors were still out there, fighting to survive? Even as the storm faded into memory, its echoes lingered. On Lake Huron, O'Malley and his men navigated through a graveyard of ice and debris, saving what they could, mourning what they could not. Every ship, every life, it changed us, he said. We weren't the same men when we stepped on land. Ice-coated docks creaked under the sun's weak November light. Towns faced weeks without power, and families began the painstaking work of rebuilding. Some would, and ever return to the lakes. Others would carry scars for life. Put yourself in their shoes. Could you have survived such relentless force? Would you have found the strength to rebuild afterward? The white hurricane left a mark far beyond the frozen waters. Survivors shared their stories for decades, recounting the blinding snow, the deafening waves, and the unyielding courage that kept them alive. Ships lost were memorialized, heroes remembered, towns rebuilt slowly from the ice and devastation. And though the storm finally ended, it had taught the Great Lakes region a brutal lesson. Nature is merciless, unrelenting, and utterly indifferent to human ambition. Those who survived were forever changed, bound by memories of nights where ice, wind, and water merged into a living nightmare. The storm had relented, but its legacy was just beginning. The white hurricane had taken, crushed, and frozen, yet it had also revealed the depths of human endurance, courage, and will. And now, as families counted survivors and mourned the dead, the question remained, what would you have done if you'd been there, clinging to wreckage, staring into waves taller than buildings, praying for dawn? How old would you have been, and could you have survived the fury of the white hurricane? The morning after the storm, the Great Lakes region was unrecognizable. Ice-coated wreckage floated in every harbor, docks were shattered, and towns were buried beneath drifts taller than houses. For the families who had survived, there was relief, but also a deep, gnawing sorrow. Over 250 lives were lost, dozens of ships destroyed, and hundreds more narrowly escaped death. The toll was staggering, and the memories of that night lingered like frostbite on the soul. John O'Malley walked the frozen shoreline, staring at remnants of vessels that had been lifelines just days before. It looked like the world had ended. "Dead," he said. Every splintered plank, every twisted chain was a testament to the storm's merciless power. Could you imagine facing that scene and knowing some you loved were never coming back? Towns began the painful work of rebuilding. On Lake Huron, families salvaged what they could from frozen wreckage, fires were rekindled, and ice was chipped away from docks and roads. Sarah Whitman and her children, grateful to have survived, spent hours clearing snow and repairing their home. "We were alive," she said, "but everything else, gone." Across the lakes, communities shared in collective grief and recovery, neighbors helping neighbors, strangers pulling together to restore order from chaos. Yet the psychological scars ran deep. Those who survived the white hurricane spoke of nights haunted by roaring winds, the taste of salt on frozen lips, the endless waves, and the faces of men and women they could not save. How would you have recovered from something that stripped not just possessions, but a sense of safety, of normal life? The storm also forced change. Shipping regulations were tightened, ice patrols were organized, and meteorology began to gain urgency as a science capable of saving lives. The white hurricane taught an unforgiving lesson. The lakes were beautiful, powerful, and deadly. No amount of experience, no number of vessels could completely tame them. And yet, despite the loss, the lakes continued to shape the lives of those who depended on them, challenging and inspiring resilience. Imagine witnessing a disaster that changed rules, towns, and lives forever. Could you have adapted, learned, and survived again? Communities remembered the heroism as much as the tragedy. Rescue crews who risked everything were celebrated, memorials were erected for those lost, and stories of courage passed through generations. Mike Gallagher, Thomas Reed, and Dave Matthews became part of local lore, their survival tales told alongside cautionary warnings of nature's power. Families who lost loved ones mourned, yet found solace in shared experience. Could you have found hope in such despair? How would you have honored those who didn't make it? Years later, historians and survivors alike would reflect on the white hurricane not just as a storm, but as a defining moment in Great Lakes history. It reshaped communities, enforced new safety measures, and left a stark reminder of human vulnerability. People learned to respect the lakes, to listen to weather warnings, to never underestimate the combination of cold, wind, and water. But even with knowledge and preparation, the storm remained a testament to nature's supremacy, a force that could humble the strongest, the most experienced, the bravest. And now, I want to hear from you. What would you have done if you'd been caught on those frozen waves? How old would you have been when the white hurricane struck? Did your family ever experience a winter storm, hurricane, or shipwreck that changed their lives forever? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments. Let's remember those who faced unimaginable fury and honor the courage that kept them alive. The white hurricane claimed lives, reshaped communities, and forever altered the Great Lakes. But in its wake, it also revealed the unbreakable spirit of humanity, the will to survive, to help others, and to rebuild when the world seemed lost to ice, wind, and wave. Its legacy is frozen in history, but its lessons, courage, and stories live on, calling us to never forget what it cost and what it taught us about the strength inside us all.